Just give me an okay. Okay. Hello. I guess we are online now. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. It's our roundtable called Preindividual Nature and Technicity. It is the 14th of October 2021. We are under a pandemic time, and we are glad to make this roundtable in English. And it's our international seminar Indisciplinar Simondon. And I would like to thank to all our guest speakers, Susanna Lindberg, Taila Picchi, and Thiago Viana. I will be introducing our first guest speaker, Susanna Lindberg, who will be followed by Diego, and then we're going to have a debate with Taila Picchi, and everyone who's want to get involved could send questions through the chat on YouTube. So please feel free to intervene and make your questions. Oh, I would like to thank really the participation of our guest speakers, because this roundtable created a very, we were really excited to make this roundtable. We guess these concepts are really important in Simondonian thinking, pre-individual, nature, and technicity. So it's a philosophy of nature, and then we have technicity, which is a very important concept. So I'm really glad to have you all here, and we expect to have a very nice conversation. I will introduce Susanna, who will make the first presentation, and then we're going to have Diego, and then I will introduce him, and finally, Taila Picchi, okay? Susanna Lindberg, who's from Finland, who's living now in Netherlands, is a professor of continental philosophy at the University of Leiden in Netherlands. She's a specialist of German idealism, phenomenology, and contemporary French philosophy. In recent years, her research has carried on the questions of technology. Her presentation is titled Schematizing Gesture and the Physis. So, please, Susanna, do it.
Yes. So, thank you very much, everybody. I'm really thrilled to be here. It's nice to get to know this network, which is really something that shows that work is being done on Simondon a little bit all over the world at the moment. So what I will do today is really a working paper in which I will pose a simple question. How, according to Simondon, does technical activity reveal nature? So more precisely, we will see how what he calls technical thinking reveals nature. Now, this technical thinking is a curious thing. It's a curious kind of thinking because it functions best when it does not reveal anything. It's only when it ceases to function that it can start to think, and then it reveals nature as physis, understood as a domain of pre-individual nature. But it also reveals what its own technicity consists of. And I will start here this work, reading work, from a paragraph which comes from Mode d'existence des objets techniques. Its main chapter, Rapport entre la pensée technique et les autres espèces de pensée, un subchapter, Pensée technique, pensée théorique et pensée pratique. And what interests me here is this question of pensée technique, technical thinking. Now, in this chapter, Simondon explains that the technical act consists of two modalities. There is figural reality and reality of the ground. He uses the word fond, so it could be background or ground, or I don't know how it's been translated. Now, this duplicity is not always visible. In a successful technical action, the same gesture is reiterated endlessly, and the action arrives always to an identical result. According to Simondon, the duplicity that is really inherent to technical action only becomes visible when, I quote, the technical action fails, that is, forms with a world that it incorporates a supersaturated, incompatible system, end of quote. Now, let us examine this event. Simondon says that a successful technical action is invisible. It disappears in the utility of its product and only becomes visible when it ceases to be useful. At this very moment, its ground emerges and becomes pressing. The ground emerges as a supersaturated, incompatible element of the technical process. Thus, technical action requires something that overflows it and that is incompatible with it. But normally action abstracts from this superfluous dimension, and actually it needs not pay attention to it in order to act smoothly. And now, in passing, one can note how much this description resembles what Heidegger says in his famous description of the equipment, Zeug, that he gives in Being and Time. There too, equipment first disappears in its use. It is in the mode of readiness to hand, Zuhandenheit. It can also become apparent in its own being, appear in the mode of presence at hand, Vorhandenheit. If its use is interrupted by broken or malfunctioning equipment, missing equipment, or disturbing equipment. The rupture of utility makes the equipment visible as such, first simply as equipment that needs to be fixed, but then eventually as a starting point of investigation of being in the world in general, although Heidegger does not really develop this aspect in Being and Time. Later books he does. Now, Simondon too thinks that the technical activity, which of course generally uses an equipment, becomes thinkable at the moment of its rupture. Unlike Heidegger, however, in the passage that we are studying, Simondon does not attract attention to the technical object, the Zeug, but to the technical activity itself, that now appears as a way of relating the agent to the world. He says that the interruption of the technical activity consists in desynchronizing and disorientating the activity. And this is then the moment when we see that the activity consists of two realities, the figural one and the ground. Now, what are these two aspects? As I said, at the first stage of the demonstration, the distinction figure-ground characterizes the technical activity itself rather than the object. What Simondon calls the figure of the activity is, I quote, the scheme of action, the habitude, the structure, gestures that the human being has learned, end of quote. Therefore, it is techne, in the ancient Greek sense of skill and know-how, which has to be learned through discipline and practice that impose their structure and rhythm onto the body, like a violinist has learned her skill through assiduous practice. The figural activity is a gesture. It's controlled bodily movement that deconstructs the distinction between dull body and intelligent mind, and presents here the idea of an intelligent body instead. The technical object itself is so well adapted to this activity that its form or figure does not come forth as such. But we have no doubt that its form is perfectly adapted to the figure of the technical activity, like the bow of a violin corresponds perfectly to the movement of the violinist's arm and fingers. Now, this interruption of the technical activity does not come from the activity itself. Here, Simondon does not take into account the possibility that the worker could be tired or make a mistake. The technical activity seems to have the ideal... Sorry. Mulla on kokous, nyt ei käy ollenkaan. Yes, sorry. Sorry, it's a noisy one. So, the technical activity seems to have the ideal purity of a gesture that is repeated always in the same manner. It's developed into the mastery, into a machine-like functioning. If the repetition stops, its interruption comes not from the activity itself, but from the world in which the activity is exerted. In reality, from the matter on which the technical activity is exerted. I'm quoting, "The reality of the ground is the dynamism of things. Whatever makes them productive and gives them fecundity, effectivity, and utilizable energy. It is the thing as power and not as a structure. The matter as reservoir of tendencies, qualities, and properties," end of quote. Heidegger, as you remember, only paid attention to the breakdown of the tool, which stops work. Simondon now describes the emergence of the materiality, which appears to be in principle the materiality of the material that is being worked upon, like an irregularity of the wood that a carpenter is sculpting. But I think in principle it could also be the materiality of the tool itself, like the polishing quality that comes forth when the carving tool has dulled. The rupture caused by the matter does not simply stop work, like in Heidegger's description of the broken equipment. Instead, the matter emerges as a possibility. If it is a possibility, in principle, it can stimulate the invention of something new. Perhaps an irregularity in the wood can inspire the carpenter to make new kinds of legs to the table. Or an irregularity in the tool can inspire him to a new kind of a skillful gesture. Perhaps the dull knife is good for polishing. There is more to the matter than the figural technical activity knows or cares to know. And the rupture happens when this more comes forth. Now, what is this more? It is matter as an abundant and plentiful reserve of possibility that Simondon likens to the ancient physis. Simondon's criticism of hylomorphism is well known. Here we see how he breaks with its schema by reinterpreting the distinction between a form and a matter. He starts by reinterpreting the activity of work. The form is not the abstract model that the production tries to reproduce. It is not a Platonic archetype, nor even the form that the Aristotelian technicity has in mind. Instead, the form is in the figurative capacity itself, as it is realized in the technical activity. Form is not in the plan that the technician follows, but in the very gesture of forming. Correlatively, the matter is not the passive Aristotelian matter, hyle. The matter is the physis that is not passive, like Aristotle's hyle, but active, like that pre-Socratic physis. Physis is matter firstly as what interrupts the human calculations that orient the formative work, and secondly as what reserves a profusion of possibilities that were previously unimaginable. It is, I quote, the potentiality of nature, much more rich than simple virtuality, the ground of the modality of possibility. It is the true virtuality of the physis, the virtuality that is not in the power of humans and that is nonetheless a power. It is pure power, the absolute power, end of quote. Now, what is this absolute power of the physis? We find a clue to it in a complement to the book Individuation à la lumière des notions de forme et d'information. This complement is titled Histoire de la notion d'individu, and Simondon starts it by explaining the earliest Greek philosophy in terms of a fundamental opposition between physis and structure. The first version of the physis comes, of course, from the Ionian physiologues, whose work consisted in looking for the fundamental element of being. And the first version of the structure comes from the works of Parmenides and Pythagoras, whose work consisted in looking for a fundamental structure of things. In the case of the Ionian physiologues, it does not matter whether the fundamental element is water, air, or fire. What matters is that the elements, I quote, give the first sketch of the notion of matter which is anterior to any distinction between matter and form, end of quote. This elemental matter, as you know, is the illimited apeiron. It's dynamic and productive. Homogeneous elements find in themselves a heterogeneity into which they change. Actually, all elements can change into one another. In the moment of rupture described by Simondon in Le mode d'existence des objets techniques, it is precisely this kind of a productive virtuality that bursts forth. It is nothing definitive, but it can become other. It can generate heterogeneity. In Individuation à la lumière des notions de forme et d'information, Simondon then contrasts the Ionian physis with the Parmenidean conception of being, which is a full, unchanging individuality, which must be related in relation to a limit, peras, the most perfect individuality being the sphere, which includes its limit in itself, and is therefore a structure that is totally contained in itself. This kind of an individuality is a structure. The opposition between physis and structure is very important for Simondon. Being is not for him either the one or the other, but the way in which the structure tries to impose a form on physis and the physis breaks free from the structure. And we'll see in a minute how this opposition takes another turn in the specific context of technical activity. Before that, I would like to attract your attention to the fact that by differentiating between two figures of matter, the passive hyle and the active physis, we recognize actually another intuition that Simondon shares with Heidegger, not in Being and Time, but in Introduction to Metaphysics and his works on Heraclitus. Heidegger pays less attention to hyle, but he rejects the interpretation of being as passive substance and invites to interpret being as active physis instead. Like Simondon, he thinks physis at the same time as what reserves itself and as what gives being in a plentiful and abundant manner. Furthermore, Heidegger thinks physis as coupled with techne. Techne wants to use being as a resource, hyle, but physis overflows its designs, refusing to comply, but also giving superabundantly more than techne requires. Simondon, of course, speaks very little of Heidegger, and if he does, it's more in order to reject Heidegger's conservatism. But in these specific places, he is actually quite close to Heidegger's fundamental intuitions. Now, here I set out to clarify the technical action. Its interruption shows that it consists of two modalities, figural reality and the ground. The detour via the pre-Socratics has helped us understand better the notion of the ground, which is certainly not a firm foundation on which one can set technical structures, but the physis as an unpredictable, surprising elemental horizon that gives and reserves all material possibilities without imposing any on them. But what about the figural reality? It has certainly something to do with the notion of the structure, but it is not the structure in the sense of a metaphysical model or prototype that would be mysteriously imprinted on the physis. Instead, as we saw, structure comes to being in technical action. Structure is gesture. How does this happen? We find a useful clue to this question in another complement to Individuation à la lumière des notions de forme et d'information, alagmatics. Alagmatics is Simondon's name for a theory of operations. It is not easy to define an operation, he says, but, I quote, one can say that an operation is what makes a structure appear or what modifies a structure. The operation is the ontological complement of the structure, and the structure is the ontological complement of the operation. The act contains at the same time the operation and the structure, end of quote. If one says simply that the act realizes the structure, one avoids the question of instead of answering to it. The structure is not there before the act, as if it could exist independently of it. But the structure is something that is contained in the act itself. The act structures, or as Simondon also says, schematizes. And now the real question is, how is the act schematized? As we saw earlier, technical activity is not a natural, spontaneous becoming. It is always schematized and structured, or more precisely, it is schematizing and structuring. It is a gesture that is already schematized by what it has learned, and it is already schematizing in what it invents. Simondon explains the difficult notion of the act by referring to Descartes' cogito. I quote, "In the act of the cogito, the act of thinking grasps itself at the same time objectively as a structure and subjectively as the operation. End of quote. As you know, the cogito is both the metaphysical structure of the thinking thing and the philosophical operation of doubt. The original gesture of Descartes' thought, his unique path and trace of thinking, consists in the schematization of the cogito in the process of doubt. In other words, the philosophical structure of the cogito does not pre-exist the activity of doubt, but it is discovered in, through, and thanks to the process of doubting. And this is how Simondon manages to think the figural reality in a very original way. The figure now has nothing to do with the Platonic paradigm. It is neither the eidos imitated in a thing, nor the eidolon imitated in a work of art that imitates the thing. On the contrary, the figural reality is born in the technical operation, which both reproduces the gesture already learned previously and schematizes the possibilities offered by the physis. Figural reality is born out of the schematizing gesture, in which an operation makes a structure appear or modifies an existing structure. As you know, Simondon also defines allagmatics as a universal cybernetics. Cybernetics, as you remember, is the theory of control in which the operation does not carry simply on the object, but also, thanks to feedback, back on the operating subject. Being an allagmatic operation, the cybernetic operation does not simply reiterate the piece of information, like a code or a message, that constitutes it as an operation. That is, it doesn't repeat just a predetermined technical command. Much more fundamentally, it is capable of receiving information. In communication et information, Simondon defines information as follows, I quote again, "Information is not a thing, but the operation of a thing that arrives to a system and causes a transformation." End of quote. A cybernetic system is a system which is capable of receiving the incidence of information and of reacting to it, transforming in function of it. Now, it is of course quite strange to explain cybernetics through pre-Socratic thinking. But in this particular case, this is what happens. Physis is information, and information is physis. When a technical operation succeeds in simply repeating the same gesture without obstacles, it does not receive information from its surroundings, but simply operates, so that it only encounters its surrounding as hyle. Only the moment of the interruption of the operation, previously explained as the appearance of the physis, informs the operation of something else than itself, and opens the whole field of virtualities and potentialities. They are interpreted as information if the technical operation reacts to them by interrupting itself, then by reorienting itself. Somehow the gesture interprets these new virtualities. That is to say, if the interruption of the technical action leads to the transformation of the action, the system can be called cybernetic. In Communication et Information, Simondon explains the notion of information further. On the one hand, the system can receive information because it is in a metastable state. If it was completely structured, a system in the sense of a completed structure, it could not change at all. But if it did not have some kind of provisional stability instead of pure dispersion, it would also be impossible to identify the event as a transformation of an earlier state. And this is why only a metastable system is capable of transformation in the proper sense of the word. Something arrives to its form, transforms it, reforms it. The cybernetic system is therefore necessarily metastable. In a sense, one can say that matter is metastable too. This is why it can be worked upon in the first place. But perhaps it is more exact to say that matter as Hyle is metastable. It can be worked upon because it is open to change, whereas matter as physis is something else. It interrupts work, opens the instant of pure dispersion, where structure cannot be imposed. It is wild and uncontrollable. Precisely this instant of pure dispersion is capable of interrupting the schematizing gesture. It can become the information that rejuvenates the gesture, but it can never be converted totally to information. All virtualities are never captured by technical action, and this is also why there is also inevitably loss, decay, and pollution. That the description of technical activity that we have been following here does not take very much into account, but we can notice its existence here. On the other hand, the information that comes to the system must come to it in a transductive manner. As it is well known among readers of Simondon, transduction is neither the deduction that goes from general to singular, nor the induction that goes from singular to general, but the process that goes from singular to singular, passing from next to next, without ever rising to anything like a meta-level. The concept of information introduced by Simondon is the contrary of a message that would be ready before the transmission and that would be delivered similar as it was sent to the receiver. Information, on the contrary, is something new and unexpected. It informs precisely because it was not known before its occurrence. Each the moment when technical action is supersaturated, like in the quotation that we started by, that was, I quote again, the technical action fails, that is, forms with a world that it incorporates a supersaturated, incompatible system, end quote. The occurrence arrives only when something is interpreted as information. Also, the information is not received similar as it was sent. It was not sent by anybody or anything, but it becomes information only at the moment when it destabilizes the system of technical action and gets interpreted. Information is just a disturbance until it is interpreted. It must be interpreted in order to appear as information in the first place. And the interpretation does not discover an already constituted sense, but on the contrary, it creates sense, produces sense to what was not sensible before the interpretation. In the same way, the encounter with physis is an encounter with something that was so far merely a possibility and actually a profusion of multiple possibilities. When this something is interpreted by the technical action, its character of possibility changes into information or reality. Its reality is precisely its capacity of changing the sense of action. This is also changing the way this technical action schematizes its task. The transductive event of information has thus caused a change in the metastable system, and this change can finally only be a change in the technical action itself. Now, to conclude, what has this little reflection shown? We have first seen how the interruption of technical activity reveals nature as physis. Physis can be, on the one hand, a supersaturated metastable field that stimulates new technical inventions. But it is always also inevitably a pre-individual field whose virtualities can never be completely seized by any technical activity. We have also seen that the interruption of technical activity reveals the technical gesture itself as an other metastable system. The gesture is structuring and schematizing. This means that the structures that it has learned in the past and the structures that it must invent for the future in order to overcome the interruption are not the same. Between them, there is a possibility of change that comes forth thanks to the interruption caused by the surprise of the matter. Technical gesture contains its own virtualities and pre-individual possibilities that the interruption of technical activity brings forth. And that is, I think, the moment of pure invention. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Thank you so much. It was a really impressive presentation. It resonates a lot with our previous roundtable on materialities. And we had the opportunity to have Kate Lloyd Thomas and Cecile Malaspina. So it's great to have your analysis and a lot of Simondonian concepts. Thank you so much. I think we're going to have opportunity to develop a little bit more after both presentations that are following. Thank you so much, Susanne. So I would like to introduce now Diego Viana, who's part also of our network, RELES, La Rede Latino-Americana de Estudos Simondonianos, the Network on Simondonian Studies. And Diego Viana is an economist from the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and he has a master in political philosophy from the University of Paris 10, Nanterre, and a doctor in humanities of the University of São Paulo, with a visiting period at the Laboratoire du Changement Politique et Social à l'Université Paris 7. And the title of his presentation is The Phaseless and the Phase, Outlines of a Reemergent Conception of Nature in Simondon. Please, Diego.
Okay, let me just... Well, thank you, Thiago. Thank you also, Susanna and Taila, and all who are watching. I think my presentation will resonate a lot with what we just heard. Because I'd like to bring to you something that more than a work in progress is kind of a research program, so to say. It's a constellation of studies centered around Simondon, which I'm trying to build up into one single cohesive argument. So please bear with me. And also, I'd like to say that what follows is motivated by what I believe to be renewed interest in the category of nature as a common tendency that traverses several currents in philosophy and the humanities too, and which recovers this sense of the Greek physis that was somewhat suffocated and that we've just heard a lot about as well. So as I see it, this is characterized by a subordination, so to say, of substantiality to Genesis, an emphasis on becoming, an indelible tension between determinacy and unboundedness. And this undercurrent relies on productivity, process, emergence, and a certain holism too. So if there is indeed this reemergence of nature, of the category of nature, then I think we can safely say that there must be a place in it for Simondon. Well, I should begin, of course, with a word about what I believe motivates this renewal. So firstly, the critical conjuncture of the Anthropocene sets the stage for a critique of the mechanistic conception of nature inherited from mostly, as we figure it, Cartesianism. So in the last century and a half, roughly, this modern scission between human and nature has become progressively untenable. Hence, such takes as Whitehead's criticism of the dual culture, which was retaken, of course, by Stengers and now Delbez as well, Latour's denunciation of the modern constitution, Philippe Descola work on nature and culture, and of course, many others. But this critique also stems, of course, from scientific advances and historical circumstances. So I should like to mention the development of a systematic ecology where biologic, meteorologic, geologic, techno-economic input is analyzed together systematically as a whole, and with information, of course, as a ubiquitous concept, which is determining. And simultaneously, of course, the politics, economy, and ethics of climate change materialize in COPE meetings, IPCC reports, ESG documents, green bonds, what have you. Yet, this reemergent concept of nature, as I'm calling it, doesn't correspond to any of this, of these practical imperatives. Sooner, it confronts them. It flies in its face, so to say. It rejects them. And a possible reason is that it's quite possible to think in consonance with the conceptual framework of the modern economy, leading to projects that seek to adapt the global economy, making it sustainable, and thus achieving what would be a sustainable development. We all know this. In other words, to adjust a few parameters, but keep a certain system of values and procedures standing on roughly the same grounds. By doing so, one subscribes to the idea that whatever crisis we're traversing is simply a matter of the choice of energy sources that doesn't put into question the understanding of what it means to act, live, relate, be in the world. So I believe that this reemergence of nature stems to a great extent from this confrontation. What is rejected is this hypostasis of a historical way of life. And though I mentioned sustainability and development, I believe the concept where this is most clearly expressed is environment. Because there seems to be an implicit dissatisfaction with the current use of this term, which today rivals and even replaces nature in many uses. And given the advance of human manipulated processes over non-human processes, so for example, built structures over biomass, we've been reading a lot about this in the last few years, we've reached the point where some scholars speak of the end of nature, thinking after nature, or substituting environment for nature. I was going to show some covers of book with these titles, but we've been having problems with screen sharing, so I left that aside. But anyway, the argument here is that nature, the term nature, refers to a sense of the environment as untouched by human activity. Well, this use of the term environment is clearly unsatisfactory, and it's tributary of the notion of the scission between nature and culture. The distinction between natural and built environments blurs its own reference. What is it an environment of, so to say? Is it the human? Because if so, the notion of built environment is completely devoid of sense. The built in this opposition refers to the technical, but the loss of reference empties the technical of its very meaning, removing its apparative character in assembling physical and social processes. And ultimately, as Arne Vetlesen points out, to think the Anthropocene through the environment thus understood deprives the concept of its power to make us think and invent. So, the problem ultimately amounts to developing a non-substantialist sense of nature. This is a reason, I believe, why we've been witnessing a growth in interest for Simondon, of course, and also for Schelling, who criticized Kant and Fichte for obliterating the natural physicalist ground of the transcendental, and also for Whitehead, as I mentioned before. But mostly, I'd also mention Lucretius and the Epicureans, who, according to Thomas Nail, developed their materialism not from atoms, properly speaking, but from corporeal flows, which are thus non-substantial. Also, the interest in Amerindian multinaturalism may have a similar root, I believe it does, as it refuses an isolation of the human from other modes of being in the world. Donna Haraway insists on the need to make kin with other species, and the same goes for Stonger's ecology of practices, in a lesser extent, Huey's cosmopolitics, and the list goes on. But my role here is to outline how Simondon's philosophy contributes here to this, so to say, effort. And I think it's a rather strong contribution, you can imagine. To begin with, this current notion of environment is substantialist and corresponds to the counterpoint of a hypostasized entity, namely the human. It ignores the multiplicity of becomings involved in the emergence of structures and other irregularities that compose the constitutive activity of life. It's incompatible with the notion of associated milieu, very Simondonian, as it ignores the role of exchange, information, communication that constitute psychosocial, social, and transindividual processes. So after this long introduction, the first key passage for my purpose here belongs to the last paragraph of the introduction to individuation, when Simondon paraphrases Aristotle, writing that being is said in two senses. The first, fundamental, as he says, is being as it is. And the second, being as individuated, is, as he says, always superposed to the first in logical theory. There seems to be here a staple of philosophies of nature as crystallized in the classical Spinozal distinction between natura naturans and naturata, which in turn, it's important to mention, inherits from the Kabbalistic Ein Sof, which meant then God before creation, the God of infinity. And I mentioned this because infinity is indeed one of the possible translations of the aperon, the indefinite, which in Anaximander is the adjective that qualifies nature, aperos physis, the indeterminate growth. So being as it is, as opposed to being as individuated, corresponds to the pre-individual, which is also said the phaseless being. So when Simondon evokes, for example, the theme of anxiety, he writes that the subject, I quote, feels its division into pre-individual nature and individuated being. The individuated being is here and now. And this here and now, in the French edition, he uses the Latin hic et nunc, prevents an infinity of other here and nows from coming into existence. The subject becomes conscious of itself as nature, as undetermined, aperon, and as something that it will never be able to actualize into a here and now. End of quote. So as this passage suggests, a second staple of philosophies of nature is the emphasis on genesis, the birth of beings. Simondon makes it clear that more than an explanation for different kinds of individualities, his theory is potentially a full-scale metaphysical notional reform. Simondon claims that the theory of individuation is a theory of becoming itself. The becoming of being, in that being is said, as he says, what has become as individual and milieu. And by doing so, Simondon inscribes his thought as a philosophy of the genesis eis ousian, the birth of all beings, of each being, from the being of what would appear in a more Platonic philosophy as the all. But of course, in Simondon, it is not an all, but the pre-individual, the phaseless, being regardless of its phases. And he adds, I quote, by generalizing the relativization of the individual and by transporting it into the reflexive domain, the study of individuation can be transformed into theory of being. Individuation is then situated with respect to being. It appears as a modification of the being based upon which the latter's problematic becomes enriched. It is the appearance of information within the being system. End of quote. This quote is the opening of the paragraph where Simondon presents his conception of information. But it is also his statement of metaphysical purpose, a study of individuation as a study of being, a process, metaphysics, rejecting substance. Well, in the passage about anxiety, which I read to you, the aperon corresponds to the virtuality of being implied in the subjective actuality. This is a central feature of Simondon's understanding of nature and phases. Let's look briefly at the end of the first part of individuation, where Simondon evokes the notion of neoteny, delayed forming, in biological individuation. Quoting again, these categories of increasingly complex, but also increasingly unfinished and decreasingly stable and self-sufficient individuals require more complete and more stable layers of individuals as an associated milieu. Living beings require physiochemical individuals to live. animals require plants, which are for them, in the proper sense of the term, nature, in the same way that chemical compounds are for plants. End of quote. The individuality is thus accrued by two defining concepts, namely the relationality ascribed to the subject and the margin of indeterminacy that allows for differences and deviations in actualizations. In the conclusion, he comes back to this point, stating that life and non-living matter can be treated as two speeds of the evolution of the real, so that there can be said to exist a physical that can be called the natural, and that is both pre-vital and pre-physical, end of quote. This distinction recapitulates our first citation. Being as it is precedes being as individuated logically, as he said, since when one posits an entity, being as non-individuated is presupposed. It is unconditionate and indeterminate. Yet being as unconditioned is not external, but immanent to the conditioned, the subjectum or hypokeimenon of nature. And I'd like to add one more comment on the last quote. While one may justify it in seeing layers of complexity in these needs for more complete beings, what is meant is an increment in rhythms, which reminds me of Lucretius again and his loops of nexus and contextus, which I won't develop, but just say that where life and within it the transindividual consists first in slowing the process of individuation, dwelling in the becoming of transduction, and secondly, in multiplying it. And multiplication is decisive, as we can see from the passage on anxiety, which expresses the subject, that is, the collective's communication of virtual and actual. It's in the discussion of life that we find Simondon's claim that phased being is always a polyphased being. So that being is multiple, not because it is composed, but because it is determined by the crossing of several domains of transactivity. All the more so in the case of the subject, being in the collective. So the role of these elements, namely the immanent physis, the rhythmic differential of individuation, the multiplicity of domains, is clarified when confronted with Simondon's use of the term nature in his critique of dialectics at the end of Individuation. Nature is identified with ontogenesis as the deployment of being itself. So for Simondon, the limitation of dialectics, he says, is that in it, becoming refers to moments of the substantial being, though infinite and eternal. The same goes for the Spinozist substance, which is one and therefore monophased, as he says, meaning that, and I quote, despite Spinoza's terminology, what substance lacks is being nature, end of quote. Now, while Simondon's reading of Spinoza's Deus sive natura is quite debatable, considering the absolutely infinite character of the substance, it's worthwhile to point out that in these remarks, he enjoys the company of Schelling. The rational character of Spinoza's God makes it difficult to account for the ultimate genesis of the modes that comprise nature. The problem for both Schelling and Simondon is to find the tensions, potentials, the emergence of difference and signification. This problem, as they see it, is not exclusive to Spinoza. Every philosopher who wants to think through grounding nature is confronted with the question of ultimate genesis. It's also a feature shared with these contemporary thoughts of flux, genesis, and nature that I briefly mentioned in the beginning. I'd like to think of it as a sort of generalized atomless kledamen. I think that's how you pronounce it. But for now, I'd like to point out one particular implication of the theory of the phases of being. Because if pure individuality is an impoverishment of relations, leading to the substantialization attributed, for example, to the individual that renounces its subjectivity by giving up its bonds to the collective, then conversely, openness, accrued metastability, amounts to intensified nature, we could say. This sounds more Deleuzean than Simondonian, but bear with me. The multiplicity of phases expresses nature as becoming, as creation, as physis. If nature is becoming itself and becoming is relation, dephasing as a present that unfolds into past and future, smaller and greater, then the intensity of nature is given by the multiplied relations as phases. The more a flow of processes comes over itself, the more real, we could say, it is, in the sense that it sets forth more being. Being as being is no other than the multiplication of its beings as individuated. The two senses that I began with. Nature is and exists in its unfolding over itself, communicating and resonating with itself. So in this sense, the preindividual or unphased being hints at a radical philosophy of nature in which, I quote again, the problem of individuation would be resolved if we knew what information is in its rapport with other fundamental physical quantities, like matter or energy. End of quote. And here, I'd like to point out how Simondon expresses himself tentatively. He doesn't radicalize the pre-individual by subjecting energy and matter to information in this passage, as later physicists like von Weizsäcker will do. I won't get into this. The point is that had he taken this path, he'd be faced with that old problem of genetic metaphysics. What is it that becomes? Whence the structural germ? This is Hippolyte's question to him in the 1960 presentation. To which he answers, maybe we can't know that. But anyway, if individuation occurs in a system saturated with potential energy, what is the stuff of this system? And Simondon would have to face this question with a non-substantialist philosophy, which would rule out all the solutions that other doctrines gave, the atoms, the absolute spirit, the Urschleim, or whatever. Let me illustrate this problem with another very brief mention to the fact that Deleuze identifies in Simondon a new conception of the transcendental. And the question here is, why can he say this? Probably because of the analogical act, as Susanna mentioned in her speech. And the idea that, quoting again, to know how being can be thought, one must know how it individuates, for this individuation is the support of the validity of any logical operation. Thought is a certain mode of secondary individuation that intervenes after the fundamental individuation that constitutes the self. End of quote. This recapitulates at the conclusion the ending of the introduction of individuation with which I began. Thought and discourse are themselves phases of being, as he said here. The psychic precedes thought, as the latter is an affection of the former. And Simondon continues, thought is not necessarily, this is a quote, capable of thinking being in its totality. Remember Hippolyte? It is second relative to the subject's condition of existence. But this condition is not isolated and unique, for the subject is not an isolated term with the capacity to constitute itself. The substantialization of the subject as a term is a facility that thought grants itself to be able to witness the genesis and justification of itself. The subject is substantialized by thought so that thought can coincide with the subject. End of quote. Sorry if it's a long quote, but I think it's a very important one. This passage expresses a methodological issue at stake in the preparatory text about alagmatics, also already evoked, which is that grasping processes in reality and individuating knowledge consist in following these processes with a process of one's own. To think is to assume a position in the system of relations as a subject, that is, as a node in the field of significations. It also expresses in the theory of knowledge the diagnosis that appears in the theory of being, in the pages on ethics, and to the critique of misunderstandings of technicity. Namely, that the tendency to substantialize is a death knell for transactivity, knowledge, and relation. It's a source of hylomorphism, as a form is frozen into substance, thus warping an entire perspective on the objects of knowledge, and as a consequence, on nature and being. So, considered as a defacement, an analogical act with respect to the communications within processes that are already communication, knowledge is relational and collective. This entails a continuity between knowledge and a series of other activities that Simondon foregrounds, such as imagination, technicity, and ethics. All of them processes that create and communicate, dephasing being, modifying the fields where the individual unfolds. These processes engender being. They enact a new configuration as nature. The homogeny in Simondon's take on the individuation of knowledge, the ethical act, the acquisition of technicity, and technoaesthetics too, is unsurprising given the paradigmatic character of transactivity. Thus, the acquisition of techniques, for example, can be intuitive, to a great extent somatic, but it can also be purely rational, mathematical, formal. But these perspectives can be synthesized by experiencing and conceiving the actual manifestations of natural processes through technical function and invention. This is in the second part of the mode of existence, and in a manner reminiscent of Spinoza's intuitive science, or a third kind of knowledge. I won't get into this now, but I dealt with this in a presentation for Greg's in Campinas. Imagination, in turn, can create quasi-organisms that recover the lived world with a network of mediations, thus amplifying the reach of activity, understanding, and experience. The ethical act, as developed in the final pages of Individuation, can traverse different sets of relations, not as an imperative, but as a mode of communication. It moves as the relations develop. It's the gesture that refuses isolation in relation to other phases, and by which one remains subject, refraining from absolute individuality, which is lifeless, residual, a way of locking oneself within, and to which a perfectly exterior environment may correspond. Which finally leads to the conclusion, with the question, where does this leave us? Well, the multiplicity and amplification of nature in defacement, the immanence of the phaseless being, the transactivity of communication, are consequential ideas for the recovery of nature as process and genesis. As I said, the problems of exteriority, relationality, and the sense of ethical activities are crucial to the ecological problems of our day. And I hope to have shown that these problems can be approached via the polyphasic character of the pre-individual and the transindividual, which leads to asking, what are the fields where the transindividual, thus understood, becomes? So to my final quote from the Royaumont Conference, Simondon says, and writes later on, that if we consider consciousness to be a function of life and not an order of reality emerging from life, then we can posit that the resolution of vital and psychic problems, that is, evolution and invention, as he says, quote, suppose as a basis the anterior possibility of social and psychosocial aspects, which may sound paradoxical, but works if we extend the notion of social. And he continues, molecules, elementary cells, can maintain a kind of social link among themselves, implicating control, modulation, reduction of activity. Then, the psychosocial phenomenon would simply be the transductive propagation of a perturbation, which, having performed a change in equilibrium at the elementary level, reverberates at the collective level. And this is followed by the hypothesis that the great phylogenetic stages may have been conditioned by social and psychosocial phenomena. And already the notion of society at first defined for humanity extends to animal species. Sorry. This is how he wraps up the argument. This notion can be completely generalized, incorporating relations among vegetables and even molecules. Likewise, the psychosocial relation, at first defined for inter-individual human relations, is susceptible of receiving a generalization. This wasn't, end of quote, this wasn't written by Gabriel Tarde, it was written by Simondon. Such a project, generalizing the social, or at least the reach thereof, would require the possibility of identifying the prospects of internal resonance at all these orders of magnitude. We must ask, what kind of communication can subsist among numerous realms or phases, engendering communication and nature? This is where I believe Simondon resonates most richly with the reemergent conceptions of nature. They can benefit from the radical non-substantiality of dephasing the phaseless being, where the act that seizes being manifests being, in an axiontology linking individuation to the trans-individual, knowledge to ethics, and both to technicity. From this perspective, the human is decentered even if the acts of knowledge are performed by humans, because it's always an act of communication where the entanglement of phases is deformed, and thus the general modern notion of environment cannot subsist. I have 15 seconds. I'm going to pass the time in another 15, but I would really like to end by comparing this decentering of the human, also sought by many of the projects sharing a quest for a renewed conception of nature. I mentioned many of them in the introduction. I'd like to compare this to a quote from Donna Haraway, which I find very illuminating and directly resonating with Simondon. So if you'll give me a moment, she writes, "Never poor in world, Terrapolis," which is the concept she's developing in this passage of staying with the trouble, "exists in the web of always too much connection, where responsibility must be cobbled together, not in the existentialist and boundless, lonely man-making gap. Terrapolis is rich in world, rich in compost, inoculated against human exceptionalism, but rich in humus, ripe for multi-species storytelling." End of quote. I think this passage summarizes the possibility of the re-emergent conception of nature, where Simondon's phaseless and dephasing being can play an extended role. Thank you. That's all.
That's amazing, Diego. Thank you so much. So much thing to think, and a lot of food for thinking, as we say. And I would like to pass immediately to Taila, so she could make some questions, comments, and feel free to make your intervention. And then if we have questions or comments from the audience on the YouTube, please feel free to make your questions, okay? Taila?
Yeah, thank you for the invitation, and thank you, Diego and Susanna, for your talks. I found them very interesting and stimulating, and in a Simondonian way of, in a very Simondonian approach, I found them complementary. Susanna, you moved from an idea that technical activity open reflection to the notion of physis in terms of nature, while Thiago moved from nature to a societal theory, or even from nature to human nature. And actually, I don't have a specific question for both of you, but what I wonder after your talks is how this relational ontology that Simondon grounds on the notion of pre-individual, but as Susanna has shown, on the notion of information, that is a logical but also physical and also biological concept that Simondon uses in order to conceive the process of individuation. So my question is, mainly for Susanna, what's the relation, according to you, between information and regulation? Because you talk about physics as a structure of reality, as nature, as what gives material to modern science, but how this notion of information opens also to biology, like a continuation of physis. That is important also in what Thiago said about neotheny. And I think we can speak more on this notion, because through the neotheny, Simondon introduced a relation between biological and physical individuation that allow for thinking a critic to environment, as you have shown, and also an holistic conception in which nature is at the same time human nature, but also physical nature, something linked to ecology, environment, and another question that I can put is, what's the relation you see, Thiago, in between the notion of phases, phase, and regime, what Simondon calls regime d'individuation. But what I can suggest is maybe that phases of being are individual properties, while regime are linked mainly with nature as container of individuals, as something that is linked with a process and not entities. And I think both of you insist on an objective idea of nature that Simondon present and give us a useful concept, a useful toolbox to understand every kind of phenomena, biological, psychosocial, technical. I think there's only there's just one thing about the notion of technicity and technical activity. What's the link with nature? And it's for both of you. And what's the relation in the economy of an extension of the notion of nature through Simondon philosophy, of the notion of finality? What's the link with technicity? And do you see a parallelism between technicity and pre-individual being, or even a dichotomy between the pre-individual dynamism characterized by tension, potentials, and the necessity then to individuation, and technical activity? I think maybe I said in a very confused way my suggestion, but thank you again.
Nice. Thank you, Taila. You got you introduced many things, and we can get back to your topic. And but I would pass to Susanna first, and then to Diego. Okay, so we could move on.
Yes, thank you very much for these questions. Vast, big questions. I am not going to be able to answer to all of that because it implies very big reflections in Simondon and in life in general. But I will take this. You really pointed at an essential moment in what I was speaking about when we were speaking about how this information continues physis, or how what happens in this limit between physis and then information and then finally technical activity. And I would say that that information continues physis quite simply by seizing something in the physis, because physis as such is profusion. It is everything. It is pre-individual. It is not determinable to start with. But something becomes physis in that when it's seized by a process of interpretation. In my case, that was a process of a technical activity. So technical activity, in a sense, interprets something in the physics and starts to individuate it. So it's one way of individuation. There are many others, and many others are maybe more important even, but here I took the technical one. So it's this very limit, there's always something happening. It's not, how to say, the information is not one thing within this profusion of the physis. It is the moment when techniques touches the physics and grasps something in it, and then it becomes information. So all of these terms are very relative to one another. This is how I think of it. So information continuous physics, when it's taken, when it's interpreted, when it becomes actual also, that kind of things. And this is interesting because in this pre-individual field is so rich that it can never be grasped totally. And this is where Simondon goes elsewhere than, I don't know, something like more traditional theories, because there is always more to be taken. Something is taken, something is grasped, something continues a process and becomes a process. But it could be another virtuality, or the virtuality could be interpreted differently. So this is really why information and invention go hand in hand in my reading, I think so. So this is maybe what I can say to you for first. I hope it answers to something.
Yeah, I think much has been answered already, because I don't have too much to add to this kind of relation. So the thing about phase and regime, I agree with you that phase has a more singular sense, and regime would correspond to what, in the end, in the conclusion of L'Individuation, he calls the two speeds. So which goes back to what the Epicureans would call the nexus, that the loop that flows over itself and complicates itself, which when you think about it is quite a beautiful image of a multi-speeding being, in which we can think of that path. I really like that passage at the end of the first part, when he's going to introduce the question of life, when he mentions the increasing incompletion and instability, and hence the increased margin of indeterminacy of these beings, so that instead of thinking of emergent properties as in our usual language, we could speak of revolving properties. That would be an interesting notion. But I'd like to think, for example, that this allows us to say that one's physical body is, so to say, the associated milieu of our biological body. And our biological body and also our physical body are the associated milieu to our psychosocial existence, which has also its own beauty in the sense that we are ourselves a dephasing, not in our singularity as an individual, the way we usually see it, I am Diego, but within ourselves, we have dephasements, we have a polyphasing of nature through the regimes that compose us, or what we see as us. This is, I believe, one of the most compelling lessons we can take from Simondon in our understanding of our activities. And then you ask if I got it correctly. You have a question about the economy, the finality, and technicity, the relation between these three things.
I didn't talk about economy. I was wondering if there is. I was mixing your talks, reading nature through techniques, and I think it works because it's what Simondon presents at the beginning of Individuation, because he's using a technical paradigm in order to reform the notion of form through information. And he said that its technological paradigm is analogical, but at the same time, information is it's something like living. It's what makes that individuals are informed and informing. So it is something peculiar, and actually he can't give a definition. He said that information is une signification qui surgit d'un état de disparition. It say nothing practically, materially. It's saying is a very huge concept that can be referred to everything, physical, biological, and so on.
Which is still a problem today.
Yeah. And it's also I think what makes Simondon really actual, because information is something that is a notion through which we can read every kind of phenomena, technical, also the modern technology. When Simondon spoke about technical object, he was thinking, he was observing industrial machines. But we can use this notion also for laptops, communication, superstructure. There's many signification of the notion of information in Simondonian said that Simondon didn't imagine. So, but no, what I was questioning is the relation between nature, or if we prefer Preindividual, this reality of possible realization of other states, individuals, phases also, and technical activity that Simondon calls technicity, and technicity is properly, and there I see the proximity also with Heidegger. Technicity is an essence, so it's a gesture, but it's also something that objects own. A technical object, according to Simondon, is characterized by technicity, and it is what makes it concretizable, and also what determines its evolution. So, what's the relation with this notion of technicity or technical activity and an idea of finality, even if Simondon doesn't mean a useful meaning of this notion of this genetic principle.
If I may, I'd like to split the answer in two, because one thing about this the technical or the technological paradigm in the first chapter I find very interesting is that he later on he will say, I have criticized a technical paradigm and substituted a physical paradigm for it through crystallization. But what I find interesting is that he keeps calling this paradigm technical, but when you go back to the first chapter and say, oh, let's see the criticism he makes, actually it's a political paradigm, because the paradigm is slavery. Which is, so the hylomorphic paradigm is this paradigm of slavery, which crystallizes. Let's not use this word because it's too positive in Simondon. Let's use another one. It freezes forms as essences, so to say. What we lack here is exactly the technicity of the process, and then he will describe all that with the brick and so on, so on, so on. Okay, so the second part of the answer, I think actually I'm going to repeat something that Susanna already said, which is good because then it's already done. I don't have to think so much. But technicity has a very interesting link to knowledge. In that, well, when you look at the last parts of the introduction of Individuation, you will see him talk about intuition, followed by the logical process, which is in itself information, and invention. And he makes an analogy between these two things and the structural germ, which itself will start a process which is information, the transductive process. So technicity, when later on when he talks about the different places where technicity can be found in the technical object or the ensemble or the element, it's very interesting to see how he applies technicity to each of these layers when he sees them as incorporating in their own formed or schematized being the kind of relation that the invention and the technical lineage allowed for. That is a human nature relation, and this can be at various levels. And I think, for example, one thing I'd like to ask Susanna is about how important she thinks gesture is in Simondon in general, not simply in these parts, because I think gesture is the heart, for example, of imagination et invention. Because ultimately, what these objects or ensembles or elements incorporate in their structure is this gesture of relation with nature, which leads to the question of finality, of course. when Nathalie Simondon was with us a few weeks ago, one thing that she pointed out when we asked about the recurring critique of Simondon as not bringing up politics is that what Simondon does is point out that whatever your politics is, whatever your social relations are, slavery, for example, in hylomorphism, there is something that technics itself will bring forth. And that is technicity. And that is the relation to nature. So good or bad, so you can create a huge industrial structure that will destroy that will throw carbon dioxide on the atmosphere and destroy living conditions. But this is because you're being told, you're being taught that this can happen, for example. And this is something that Simondon puts is probably the only philosopher of techniques who will go that way to the end, and will put the what we obtain from technicity at a par and even above other determinations. I'm not sure this answers the question you were asking, but I think it points in an interesting direction, I believe.
Thank you.
I think Thiago had a... Oh, he's back.
I'm sorry, my connection is not that good. I couldn't follow the end of your answer, Diego, but thank you. And if you'd like to ask questions between you two, I would like to add something on our round table. I find quite interesting. I have two questions mainly. I was intrigued by the fact that nature is a very important concept in Simondonian thinking. And he has, if you could explain for me and for the audience a little bit about when Simondon explains about the concretization of the technical object, he says that this technical object tends to be naturalized, it tends to nature once the object is concretized. So, I mean, I would like to ask you, and maybe if you could help us understanding what kind of nature is he talking about when he says this. The technical object, once it's concretized, it tends to be naturalized. What's the relation between this nature of the technical object and the determinacy or the physis or the other concepts you brought to us? And when I heard also Suzanne, I understood, if I'm correct, that one of the key things to understand this physis or to make the relations that you are bringing is the technical mentality. It's something that could be an alternative to. So, if you could say a few words, if you feel like saying a few words about technical mentality, how technical mentality could be helpful in understanding the very concept of physis or this power, this pure power. So, would technical mentality help us to get back to this pure power we really need in this Anthropocene diagnosis?
There, thank you. Very, very good and really to the point questions as well. I will answer in the reverse order because it happens to pop in my head in that order. So technical mentality, in my opinion, is a nice way of looking at nature in especially in the present state of the things, because technical mentality in this case is something else than a contemplative mentality. We have enough contemplation. We don't really need that anymore. What we need is a kind of understanding of how nature really functions, what happens when techniques touches it, but techniques in the enormously vast sense. techniques, as social techniques, as artistic techniques, technological techniques, and all of that. So I think this technical mentality or technical thinking has a specific way of looking at nature as that, so to say, if I dare say, reveals nature's own technicity. And this is something very useful for us. But then, in order to say so, we should think that technical mentality should be something very different from this technological exploitation that we have in the, well, everywhere around us, really, and which creates the Anthropocene. So it should be something like a technical mentality in this very Simondonian sense, where you want to put your hands in the things that you are doing and you want to follow its dynamisms. You want to be one with it, in a sense. So this kind of a technical mentality, in my opinion, is very useful. But then it also needs to be redefined and re-understood as well, as a way of research. When it comes to nature and technical objects, so this is also, as Diego said, it's the notion of associated milieu, which is important here, that nature comes forth as an associated milieu very often. So this is how we see it. And as Diego also said, that nature is not a substantial thing. There is no such thing as a nature as such. So this is the difficulty always when we're speaking about the nature, because we think that there is the nature and we should maybe protect it, or we have already lost it, or whatever. But there is no such thing. It's somehow always relative to a situation, and looking at a nature through a technical object which is in it is a very useful way of looking at it, because this is where we are. Today, this globe is visible to us through the technical objects which are filling it. And there are savage things which are not reducible to these technical objects, but nonetheless they are shown through them. And so at least this is one important way of looking at what's around us. The wildest things in the world are somehow related to a technological reality that brings them to us. And so maybe these two perspectives. So associated milieu, yes, but I think we also need an extended sense of associated milieu, maybe more than what Simondon himself said, because we should also see what goes beyond technical functionality. So maybe these things can answer a bit. Thank you.
Yes, about concretization. That's a good question as to how to relate it to the problem of nature that we've been putting it today. He often relates it to the internal functioning of the machine, right? So the idea that the different kinds of processes aren't as isolated as in the beginning of the lineage. So there's also the example of the Gumball Turban, which everybody likes to mention, and I think the most important part of this for us is the fact that different kinds of potentialities, different kinds of flows are related within the technical object. So heat, water, they become a part of the same functioning thanks to the presence of this technical object. And then there are some other moments where he evokes this, for example, in the conditions for the construction of a certain viaduct in France where Eiffel understood the passage of the wind and thought the object, the bridge, the viaduct, whatever, according to the wind. He mentions this again in several passages about the techno-geographical milieu and how, in a positive sense, he says this, how the technical network will begin to what's the term here, to grab, so to say. That's not the good word. Vocabulary is always a problem. Will begin to insert itself in different technical, in different natural processes and become continuous with them. But I'm not sure any of this that I've mentioned answers the question of the way we've been using the concept of nature here. What I do think that can be related, and this is a step outside of what Simondon actually wrote to us. Actually, not really. There are a few articles where he suggests things like this. But it's that at every point where we have a technical evolution that relates directly to processes of nature and our own needs of life, we see the parallel modifications of these flows. So to try to illustrate this a little bit better, at the end of I think it's Culture et Technique, probably, in Sur la Technique, the volume, he talks about how this shows he had quite some foresight. He shows how when we establish a big area for agriculture, we see the regime of rain and presence of animals and the rivers change. And we understand that this is a problem. And we understand that we must somehow regulate. There was a question about regulation, I think, but we must somehow regulate our technical activities to these regimes so as to let's say potentialize them. So somehow there is concretization in this kind of reasoning. There is the idea that the technical is always the establishment of a relation, and this relation is a discovery of potentials, of virtualities that are themselves natural, which means that the relation itself has to be regulated. So I think we can go that way. I hope this helps.
Taila, would you like to make any comments? And I would have plenty of questions.
Actually, more than a comment, I put a problem. When Simondon talks about the naturalization of the technical object, he means that the object becomes more and more natural, and he presents a similar regulation than an organism, and then it seems to be autonomous to the biological or human reality. And I think this idea is useful in order to think a sort of unpredictable development of techniques and the technological development in general, but also the fact that sometimes technical objects or the technological development can be perceived as something independent from human nature. It isn't what Simondon said, since technical reality is superimposed on a natural milieu. But in this evolution of technical object becomes a new kind of milieu, is what Thiago said about the associated milieu in this sense. So I think there's the naturalization of technical objects, their concretization put the problem of the ambivalence of technology, I think, but it's an open question. But it's interesting to take into account this double soul of the technical objects, both natural and technological. And in this sense, what Simondon means with technical, it isn't our idea of modern technology. It's something different, more closer to practice activity with a production, I think quite a primitive idea of production, something before the modern concept of work as a work activity with relation and so on.
Would you like to comment anything? I would add something. I'm really excited to have this conversation with philosophers. I come from anthropology, where nature and culture are basic concepts we are always opposing, and anthropology is trying to develop since the last 50 years new approach. So Marilyn Stratton is talking about relations a lot. So I really feel like Simondon helps a lot anthropology, and anthropology somehow is helping a lot of Simondonians to think about the difference between nature and culture and everything. But I would like to add something that haven't appeared so far in your as a expression in your speech, which is primitive magic. So I mean, to deal with this physis, this pure power, and I would add pure information as a vocabulary that Cecile Malaspina was developing in her talk. What would be, and also technoaesthetics, for example, which is something that also belongs to Simondonian approach, and it's not, as Suzanne just mentioned, it's not contemplative. I mean, aesthetics is for Simondon something you experience. So what kind of relations could you establish between primitive magic in Simondonian thinking and the technicity and nature and all the concepts you just brought? I mean, I think primitive magic could be helpful in relating to the different ways of approaching to nature.
Probably somebody remembers better than me what Simondon actually says about this magic in at the end of the mode d'être d'objet technique. But I think that we can say here in this context very simply that magic is of course a kind of a technique as well. If you want to control natural phenomena, so well, you can use magic as well as information technology. It's not the same kind of technology, of course, but it's the same attitude. And maybe in magic you need to be somehow closer to the so-called natural objects in that case, because otherwise the jaguar will eat you instead of obeying to you. So you have to be careful with it, of course. But I think it goes together. So what I was describing as technical act or technical attitude, well, that could be magical as well. Personally, I don't see, I see the differences of degree, but not the difference, fundamental difference of the nature between them. But then Simondon has these considerations of the sacred, which for me are, well, they are more strange. I never really followed him there. So maybe somebody else remembers them better.
Oh, can I, before I try to get into this part about magic, I'd like to ask something briefly to Susanna about figure versus ground. Well, one of the things she is specialized in is German idealism, where ground is an important concept, especially, well, for Schelling. Schelling talks about ground all the time. I wonder if she sees a relation between how Simondon uses ground and how the Germans used it in that generation.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to ask you the same question. So we can well, make a lot of Schelling here, but I really liked your way of putting Schelling and Simondon close to one another. It's really, really illuminative and interesting, and at the same time, it's difficult as well, because Schelling's ground. How do you say? He has this theological side to it. So ground is evil also. It's being when God is not there. So this is later Schelling, of course. Yeah, the first Schelling does it a bit differently, but there is always this sound. So ground is something that refuses itself from us, really categorically. So there is this side, and I don't find this in Simondon. I think that for me, Simondon's way of seeing the world is somehow more positive than Schelling's, because Schelling sees tragedy, he sees the problem of evil and the absence of God and all this kind of phenomena in the ground. So this is one big difference that I would imagine between them, but it's of course very complicated. You really have to build this relation because it's not given anywhere. I don't think Simondon ever wrote anything about Schelling, but maybe I'm mistaken. But in his time, it was hardly translated into French, and well, maybe he did not know much of that. There was something else I was thinking about concerning the ground. Yeah, I think it's really the same problem they start with. So the figure and the ground, this is really fundamental for the metaphysics of somebody like Schelling, for whom ground withdraws, a figure comes over it, but you cannot think one without the other. It's really necessary to have the dynamics between the two sides, and this is where they feel so similar. They feel very similar on this specific point. But I wonder if Schelling's ground is not more dangerous, more dangerous and more terrifying than, because he adds the element of tragedy to it. He thinks it through the idea of tragic or the evil and that kind of things. I don't know, how do you see it? Where would you push the comparison?
Well, I wouldn't go from the side of the ground, because I'm only beginning to get into these things, and I'm only getting into these things because trying to understand the whole problem of nature in Simondon brought me to Merleau-Ponty, who in turn writes about Schelling in his course on nature. And the origin of this is Bergson, who was an important reference for Simondon. So perhaps in the flow of generations, the sense of the terms begins to change. And of course, the idea of figure and ground reaches Merleau-Ponty and Simondon through Gestalt psychology. So there's a lot of coming forth and back there, and And yes, I think that's a very good way to put it. That Simondon has a more positive view. And actually, this is interesting because one of the first persons who told me to go read Simondon was a Deleuzian, and he told me go read Simondon because it will prevent you from reading Hegel. And he was going, oh, that negative thing. No, you have to think the flows, the processes, they are positive. There's no need for negative, And in a sense that is a difference between these authors, Simondon and Deleuze, of course, and funny enough, Simondon's director for the main thesis was Hippolyte, who was a champion of Hegelianism. So I wonder what I do notice about the link between Simondon and Schelling is that though in the history of the notion of individual, the part on Schelling is very small, and clearly it's secondhand. Probably the same source as Merleau-Ponty, which was Jaspers. The part, if you look at the part on Plato, it's longer than other parts on Greek authors, and it's concentrated on the Philebus and the Timaeus. I don't know how to pronounce that in English, which are exactly two very important references for the young Schelling. So it seems to me that he might have drank from that source too, which is anyway. Going back to the question about the primitive unity, which is magic. I really enjoy that part because it's very malleable. So it's so enigmatic that you can apply it the way you wish somehow. I'm exaggerating, of course. I'd like to make these little exaggerations. But if we apply to this part the same thing that I applied actually to the regimes where things flow over themselves and they don't emerge, they go back. What would appear is that the whole idea of marking privileged places and relating to a territory, which appears in this first part, is, to use an expression that probably doesn't apply very well, is like point zero of technicity. If we pay attention, well, we see that the end of Imagination et Invention deals with the same kinds of gestures, of activities that appear in the part on the essence of technicity, and most particularly on the part about the primitive unity, magic. So this would be like the point zero of which the others dephase, to speak Simondonianly. They are individuations within this ground zero of technicity, to the extent that it's always very important to remember that among the examples Simondon gives of primitive unity are holidays, alpinism, urban squares in big cities. So it's which are no different in modern metropolis than cathedrals in medieval Europe, or you have it, or I've been working with a friend about this. He's actually a geologist, but he in practice he's an anthropologist. He studies the Yanomami, and we're preparing a work about what the government in Brazil calls ethno-mapping. He hates this expression, but whatever. And it's very interesting how what the peoples do, the indigenous peoples do, in ascribing sacred values to a mount or a river or a specific plant, which is very old and gives a lot of fruit. What they do there is no different, technically speaking, from what a satellite does, or not the satellite itself, but the whole technical process that begins with a satellite taking a photo, and then either a government official or a representative of big capital does in marking a spot where you can put a wind farm, what we call lixão, which would be a waste disposal facility, or a mine. So, oh yes, and I forgot, I wanted to begin this answer with a quote from, I think it's Arthur C. Clarke, or maybe it's another writer, sci-fi writer, who says that any technology sufficiently developed is indistinguishable from magic. If it's not Arthur C. Clarke, it's someone else. But I think that quote is very interesting for this reason, because ultimately, and of course, Paul Feyerabend would insist on this over and over, that you can make as much fun as you wish of Melanesian peoples who think that the stars are whatever and the hands of a given God and so on and so forth. But that allowed them to reach the Isle of the Easter Island, in no sense worse than GPS systems today. Okay, worse is a bit, but it's even more amazing in terms of technical capacity than you and I taking a boat with GPS and gasoline propulsion and going to the Easter Islands. Probably we wouldn't even get there. They did. So there's more to the primitive unity than something that one evolves from. I think we evolve into, which is no different from other parts of Simondonian technicity theories.
May I add something? Yeah, I agree with you, with both of you. Actually, I think that primitive magic is a sort of a romantic attitude that grounds Simondonian thought, and it is also Leroy-Gourand's influence in Simondon's philosophy, and Leroy-Gourand's position after Mauss is important to produce a break with a certain French tradition, sociologist tradition, that puts opposition between religion, like Durkheim, and technical activity, and we find also this revaluation of techniques in Bergson, especially in the last part of L'Évolution créatrice. So I think it's somehow a way to take theoretical position within this KRL in France, and also a romantic attitude in Simondon thought we find also in this trust toward institutions, the fact that it doesn't conceive somehow the negativity of human existence, so it's always something conceived in a positive way. There isn't an evil part, so I agree also with Susanna.
Thank you, Taila. Thank you both speakers, Diego and Susanna. We are reaching now 2 hours of our conversation, and so far we don't have any questions from the audience. So I would like to ask you to make your final comments, and thanking you again for your kind participation and availability and interest in contributing to this international seminar. It will be available on the internet, and I hope to get back to this many times since it was really rich. So please, if you could start, I would ask Susanna, Diego, and then finally Taila to make your final comments. Thank you so much.
No, I'm just thanking you all for my part as well. It was really, really interesting, and I really adore having this technological dispositive, which allows us to be somehow, I don't know, working on the same nature, although we are so far in different natures. It's lovely, and I hope to continue these discussions at some other point. Especially the notion of nature really deserves to be digged a little bit more. Yeah. Thank you.
Me too. I'd like to thank you all. This was really great for me because I'm, as I said, beginning to get into these problems and find these references. And Susanna's presentation saved me a lot of work because answered all the questions I was going to ask myself in the following weeks and months. So I'm very happy to have been here, and I hope we can go on with these conversations. Oh, by the way, the third part of the mode of existence is Simondon says explicitly that it's inspired by Georges Canguilhem. How is that? I don't know. I have no idea, but it's just something I'd like to add. But anyway, thank you very much, and I hope to see you all very soon.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for your talks. But I want to thank you especially for the organization of this very huge and great cycle of conferences. Thank you.
So, okay, thank you so much. I would like to ask, Carolina is helping us today with our transmission, and we could go offline anytime, Carolina. Thank you so much for your support, your kind support, and thanking all the organization team for the hard work we have been doing. And we are reaching the final sessions, so we still have a few more to come, and hopefully you're gonna follow us in the next few weeks. And yes, it was a pleasure, and hope to get in touch with you all, because we would like also to make some publications and establish this network, which is Rede Latino-Americana. It's from Latin America, but now we are getting a bit spread, and it's very, very nice to have you from all parts of the world.